Welcome into the Gray Area Podcast. My name is Kevin Gray. Thanks for listening today. Appreciate you joining me on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts for free. And if you're watching this on YouTube, appreciate you subscribing to Kevin Gray Sports here on YouTube. It's our interview Friday right here on the Gray Area Podcast. I appreciate you joining me here today as I am joined by former Super Bowl winning scout, proud LSU Tiger, native of Dallas, Texas. You can also hear him, of course, on your home of the Dallas Cowboys and Texas Rangers 105 through the fan. My broadcast colleague at 105 through the fan. Bryan Broaddus good enough to join me here on the Gray Area Podcast on our interview Friday. Bryan, appreciate you taking the time today. How are you?
Doing great, KG. You kind of caught me in between working on drafts and working on covering the Mavs like you do. And there's a lot going on. You know, I feel like I'm juggling chainsaws right now. You know, I got a lot of them going in the air, but it's always good to visit with you and talk a little bit about things.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time. Well, you're someone who's run draft rooms, so juggling a couple of chainsaws, I'm sure, is not too big of a problem for you these days. You can find Bryan on Twitter at Bryan Broaddus. Of course, you can hear him on the G-Bag Nation Monday through Friday, 2 to 7 p.m. right here on, or of course, on 105.3 The Fan. Bryan, I appreciate you taking the time. Wanted to kind of get your thoughts. For a lot of people who don't know, not only did you play football at LSU, obviously you have done a lot of different things during your illustrious career in the National Football League. But for people who don't know, you have some really cool interests outside of just football and talking football and all things that is the National Football League. Before we get into that, I want to take you back to LSU and how you got started as a football player. What made you decide that the game of football was the sport that you wanted to play and ultimately turn it into a passion and a career as you have gone throughout your career?
I've been very, very blessed, KG. Started playing basically YMCA football in Dallas, Texas at 9 years old. And, you know, come from a family where my father and uncles played at Texas A&M. So I knew a lot about the game, grew up around the game, was always involved with the game. And, you know, was very fortunate throughout, my early life. I'm a DISD kid, Dallas Independent School District, and going to W.T. White, playing football there, getting a great experience there. And then, was able to play well enough to get a scholarship to play at LSU in the early 80s, and that was something that was a great experience going through the whole recruiting process. That was interesting. I wasn't a 5-star recruit or 4-star recruit or anything like that. But as an all-city player in the DISD, I had recognition. And so, that part of it that's kind of what got me started, really the early YMCA days, 9 years old. And then you get to where you could play high school football, and then it lands you a college scholarship. And I was very, very fortunate. And I went to LSU, though, at a time where they really had some outstanding players already there at LSU, played on some conference championship teams. So I went from being a big fish in a little pond to a little fish in a big pond. And man, I'll tell you what, that part of it, I just wasn't going to quit, I didn't play a whole heck of a lot. I developed the ability to deep snap. And that's what kept me on scholarship. Honestly, I wasn't big enough to play center. We had an All-American center that played. It was outstanding. And so you have to adapt, and, I wanted to stay on scholarship, and I wanted to keep playing football, and I didn't want to quit. And so you really do. And in life, you just really have to adapt to your surroundings. And, why should people keep you around? What are all the things you can do? And that part of me was that I just said, hey, I've got to make a change, because, in that day you signed scholarships from year to year to year, kind of a thing. And they find a way to get rid of you as quickly as they could if you weren't performing well enough. So very fortunate to develop as a deep snapper, making a lot of great road trips around the country. We played at USC and Ohio State and all these great places, not to mention all the SEC schools. But that's really how I got started in football. YMCA, 9 years old, and then you get to the opportunity to play, major college football.
And as someone being from Dallas, was it ever a dream of yours once you got to playing the kind of level of football that you wanted to maybe play for the Cowboys or just play in the NFL in general?
Yeah.
Or is that something that you thought about as you grew up?
It's funny. I was my first job with the Packers was my first real scouting job. I worked in NFL Europe, and I was very fortunate to work there, at a very young age, and evaluating players and stuff. And then my boss in NFL Europe told me that he says, you're too good of an evaluator to be not working in the NFL. And so I was like, well, I'm really happy doing what I'm doing here with NFL Europe and stuff like that. And so to me, that first, real job again with the Packers was like, that was like kind of a dream come true job for me to get involved. I mean, I didn't really, like I said, my evaluation skills and all that, that's where the dream was. It was always never going to be as a player. It was going to be as an evaluator, whether it was a recruiter. And I remember a really funny story. One of my first times ever going out scouting, I'm at the University of Iowa in Iowa City. And C.O. Bricado, a longtime scout at the time with the Houston Oilers and then later with the Tennessee Titans, long time, very good scout. I hook up with him in Iowa City, and he's asked me, he goes, Bryan Broaddus, he goes, I think I rejected you as a player at LSU. And I said, well, that didn't take very much scouting. I would have rejected myself too as a player there. But he, the desire was never to be a player. I knew, heck, I went to LSU thinking of grandeur. And in reality, I was just a scholarship athlete on a team that when they took the team picture, I was right there, usually number 55, right in the middle of the picture, if you did it with numerics. But I had all these players around me that were just all Americans. They were legitimate, big-time football players, and I wasn't that good. I mean, I really wasn't that good. But, like I said, they kept me around because I developed a skill. Now, my skill wasn't good enough to go on and play in the NFL as a long snapper. I'm sure if I really worked at it really, really, really hard, and not that I didn't work at it hard, but, man, those professional guys, I mean, they play in the league now 15, 18 years as long snappers. You have a hell of a career being a center, but I was good, but I wasn't NFL level good when it came to deep snap. And I didn't put them on the ground too much, but I mean, there were, like I said, those guys are to the point where they snap them, the laces are already spun where you don't have to move them and things like that. It's a real skill to be able to do that.
I'm about to say the mechanics of that position and executing it over and over and over again, I think is something that goes definitely underrated as far as the game of football is concerned. And you started to bring up, obviously, your scouting background and your jobs as far as the NFL. When did you start to develop the idea that you wanted to be a scout? When did that light bulb kind of go off for you that this was something that not only you were good at, but you wanted to continue to pursue as far as
Yeah, KG, I started with the Packers on my 27th birthday. So December 12th, 1991, I started with the Green Bay Packers and as a scout. Now, before that, I was at college. Like I mentioned, I was in NFL Europe, helped them with player evaluations the very first year of the World League in 1990 and 91 in that time frame. Before that was a college recruiter at LSU. Once I finished school, I stayed on and worked in recruiting. I went to Texas A&M and worked with R.C. Slocum's staff, his very first staff at Texas A&M, working in recruiting, assistant recruiting coordinator. So I always had that interaction with pro scouts. Scouts would come through at our schools, and I would sit down and talk about our players. Scouts, when they go to schools, they sit down and talk with a football ops guy, a trainer, an equipment guy. They usually have their sources that they use. And that was my job. I mean, I helped, I was the liaison between the program and the and the scouting in the NFL world. And I had a couple of scout guys say, hey, you ought to think about getting into scouting. And I said, yeah, I'm really happy doing what I'm doing here and recruiting at, the schools. But then I got that job in NFL Europe or the World League of American Football at the time. And it really changed me. I went from looking at high school players to evaluating college players. And I worked with some scouts at the time, some guys that were former general managers that taught me about how to evaluate, what to look for in a player. And I think it was then when I really decided that, I wanted to focus on the scouting. Now, my initial job with the Packers really wasn't in scouting. It was more of what we called a college scouting administrator. And so at the time, I had 8 scouts working with me, and I was taking their information and making sure that it was in our books, making sure at the time we were starting very new in computers, making sure we had all the data in the computer. So I was really like a glorified secretary, to be honest with you, in a nice way, administrative assistant, whatever you want to call it. But my job was to coordinate what we were doing in Green Bay with the Packers and kind of talking and keeping the scouts in mind. And it really wasn't until I left the Packers after the 96 Super Bowl when I went to Philadelphia, where I really got more involved in the nuts and bolts of evaluation. There were times at Green Bay I had evaluations, and there were times where I had to go out and write reports and go to pro days and stuff like that. But it really was kind of more of just coordinating our scouts all on the road.
It's amazing because as you detail the initial, the scouting world and how you got into it, obviously it has changed so much between then and now.
Sure.
What have you noticed specifically in how the scouting, quote unquote, game has changed and the evaluation of players and just the sheer amount of information that's available to scouts to evaluate players? How has that changed in your mind as you've seen it throughout the business of the NFL through your career?
It's amazing, KG. There's been some really good and some really bad. And I think the really good side of it was when I was first involved with the Packers in 92, there were certain college programs that just did not want you to come and visit them. They had a window of 1 week. And these were some pretty prominent programs. UCLA at the time, very prominent program. Nebraska had it rolling in the early 90s and 90s through the 90s with Tom Osborne there. They didn't want you to come visit. Joe Paterno at Penn State was not really an open book there for them. They really didn't want you to come in. There were a lot of programs that were very helpful and wanted you to come anytime you want, bring a box of donuts, come sit down, talk with us about our players. We'd love to have you. But there were some programs that I think today you see a lot more openness. Now, another thing that's gone on the bad side of this, though, is back then as a scout, when you went to a school, you were able to get medical information. You were able to get the information about how healthy these players really were. And today, because of HIPAA laws and things like that, these universities aren't going to give you medical information. So that's why the combine has become such an important tool for the scouts, because you get the workouts, the interviews, but the most important thing for the combine is so your doctors and trainers can see these players to see if they're healthy enough. So it has changed a lot, just the process of how you go through scouting. I think that there's a lot of scouts now that it's really become a young man's game. It's not the old crusty scouts, like the back in the day, the C.O. Bricados and guys like that I was meeting. Those guys would get information, write reports, turn them in, come back, and you'd have a meeting, and they would all be involved with the meeting. You got teams now like the Rams that don't meet with their scouts. They individually meet with them, but we used to meet at this time of year in groups, and we used to meet and we would set the boards and we'd put all the tags where they needed to be. And there's some teams that just don't do that. Their scouts are more information gatherers than they are evaluators. And I think a lot of that's changed over the year. When I was starting, we were trained. I mean, you didn't go out on the road unless you were trained how to go out on the road and how to handle that and how to evaluate. I think in this day and age, we see a lot of these programs will take kids, they'll hire them, they pay them not very much money, and they just throw them out on the road and say, hey, go figure it out. And I think that's sometimes think that's where you get mistakes along the way. I think if you're a guy going or a gal going on the road, you need to be able to evaluate. You need to have a plan for how you want to evaluate. And I think that's changed a lot over the years.
And along the way, you have worked with some of the real legends of the game when you talk about personnel executives and people who have been in legendary front offices. You're one of the few people who I know or have even heard of who have had the chance to work for both the Packers and the Dallas Cowboys. You've also worked for the Philadelphia Eagles, which we'll touch on a little bit later on. But you have learned from people like Ron Wolf, people who don't know that it is. That's a former longtime executive, of course, of the Green Bay Packers. What did you learn from your various stops, whether it be with the Green Bay Packers initially, obviously your longtime career with the Dallas Cowboys, working with Jerry and Stephen Jones and those individuals? When you reflect on that, what do you think about when you think about the guys that you have worked with as far as some of the real titans of the game, if you will?
Yeah, and in your research about me, KG, I worked two weeks with the Oakland Raiders. Mm-hmm. And so I worked with Al Davis, too, with the Raiders. And that was an interesting experience. One of the most fascinating interviews I've ever been on in my life. And again, with the Raiders, I was just left the Cowboys, which was funny. And I went out to the Raiders and I just had, just basically, married and had a child, my son Bennett. And so here I am, I go from the Cowboys to go, and Al Davis calls me and says, we'd like to interview for a job with the Raiders. So I go and I say, sure. So I go in May. My Cowboy contract runs out in May. Bill Parcells, Jeff Ireland, they were up front with me. They were up front. They had a pro personnel guy they wanted. Totally on. That's cool. They were up front with me about that. So I interview with the Raiders, like my contract runs out on a Tuesday. Friday, I'm in Oakland talking to Al Davis. And it was one of those fascinating interviews, I ever had. So he interviews me in May. He doesn't call me back till August. So I'm going the whole summer, not even knowing if I had a job or not. I'm talking to Peter King about going to work with Inside the NFL, on that show, as the anonymous scout.
Yeah.
So it looks like it's going to be, I get a call from Al Davis and basically he says, hey, come to Alameda. We want to bring you in. I'm like, great. So I get to Alameda, I get my office set up there and it's fascinating. I'm working for the Raiders. And so my wife at the time, Kathy, goes, hey, when are we going to move out to California? When are all the moving expenses? When's all this? And I'm like, well, I haven't talked to Mr. Davis about it. She goes, oh, okay. So another week goes by and she goes, hey, listen, come on. What are we doing here? You're out there trying to help the Raiders. We're at home. I got Bennett. What are we doing? When can we come out to? And I'm like, let me ask Mr. Davis. So I asked Mr. Davis, I go, sir, my wife's asking about coming out and finding a place and all that. And Mr. Davis goes, Bryan, listen, this is what I want to do for you. We have a hotel next door you can live at. I'm like, okay. He goes, I want to pay you about $2,000 a month to work with the Raiders. And I look at him and I say, Mr. Davis, I've got a wife and a son. I don't think I could do it for $2,000. He says, well, if you can't do it, then you might want to pack your stuff and just head on home then.
Oh, jeez.
And I'm thinking like, did I make him mad? Did I do an evaluation? Did he not like to sit? But he was really looking for an entry-level guy. And, he felt like that I was out of a job and I needed an opportunity. The sad thing about it is, KG, if I wasn't married, I'd have probably done it. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I had a life again. I was thinking making six figures. I was thinking living in Oakland, California at the time. I'm going to have to make
normal, reasonable person.
Yeah, I need normal. But if I was single, I might have lived in that hotel and stayed and worked for the Raiders for $2,000 a month. But that was really it. And and it was kind of sad along the way too that I've had opportunities, and then Kathy and I got divorced, not because of that, but, we got divorced. And so, I had opportunities to go and work with other teams, but I stayed to help take care of Bennett. I didn't want to move somewhere and not be able to take care of my son, who's now going to be a freshman at the University of Texas this fall. So, yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where, opportunity, you talk about working with some of the titans of the world. You appreciate it. You really, really do. You learn a lot along the way. Ron Wolf, I learned a ton along the way. Working for Bill Parcells, learned a ton. Working for Al Davis for 2 weeks, I learned a ton. And that's the kind of things, though, you go through when you're trying to get these jobs. If you're somebody that's young and you're like, well, how do you get a job in scouting? It's still what it is. I mean, these jobs are really who you know, and you get opportunity along the way. People always ask, hey, how do you do it? How do you get? I'm like, well, I was a college recruiter. Somebody at NFL Europe, a boss of mine recommended me. That's how I got a job. And I think that's this day and age. If you don't know somebody to at least get in the door, it's really, really hard to get in this profession.
And with that, you have obviously ran draft rooms. You ran Philadelphia's draft room back in the late 90s. You've worked with Andy Reid as far as the Philadelphia.
We hired Andy. We still had, it was Ray Rhodes.
Ray Rhodes at the time. I'm sorry. Yes.
Head coach. And then, but what happened was I had worked with Andy in Green Bay, my 5 years in Green Bay. And I loved Andy. Andy was a neighbor of mine. To this day, Andy Reid and I are still friends. And, but I recommended Andy to Jeff Lurie, the owner, and Joe Banner. And it's so funny when I left Philadelphia after that 1 year after the draft, the next year they hired Andy Reid, but they didn't know anything about Andy Reid. We had a meeting in Philadelphia there at the Vet, 3-4 hour meeting, just talking about Andy Reid, we wanted to hire him as an offensive coordinator when John Gruden went on to the Raiders. Mm-hmm. And at the time, teams were able to kind of block you from hiring these guys. And the Packers blocked us from hiring Andy as the OC, or he would have been with us quicker. But that he was so impressed, they were so impressive in the interview that Mr. Lurie and Joe Banner gave him the job the next year after we're gone. So I feel like I had a hand in Andy Reid getting there, but I also felt like we had the draft that got him going with Trey Thomas and Jeremiah Trotter and those guys. Because then in '99, Andy took Donovan McNabb, and they started, Brian Westbrook and guys like that. They really started building their team the right way, and they had a dominance for the years that Andy was there.
And you set up the Philadelphia Eagles for over a decade and a half of a good run as far as the NFC East was concerned there. And speaking of the NFC East, we know that you worked, for people who don't know, you worked for the Dallas Cowboys specifically with Jerry and Stephen Jones. Can you tell us a story or two from your time working with them in that organization that people may not necessarily get an idea of what it means to work for Jerry and Stephen Jones in that way?
No, it's the Jones families they're fascinating people, and they really are. And the questions that they ask you as an evaluator are intense in a lot of ways. I know people are very much like, oh, the Joneses don't do this, the Joneses don't know that, and all that. Jerry is not a traditional general manager. He's, it's very much, but we have families that run teams in the NFL. We have families, the Rooney family, the McCaskies in Chicago, the Maras in the Giants, Cincinnati, the Brown family. They're not traditional general managers. I mean, those guys don't go out and scout. And so, with Jerry and Stephen, the stories I always remember about them were, when you were in that setting and how you were challenged as a scout. And Jerry was a great listener. I never found Jerry Jones to be difficult as far as listening. The problems that you might have along the way were that Jerry and Stephen, it might be who gets to them last. Maybe you're making a tremendous point about a player and you're trying to get them to come on board with this player and you're doing a great job, but then they go talk to Barry Switzer or they go talk to Jimmy Johnson. And not to say that Barry Switzer or Jimmy Johnson or those guys don't have a really, really good football opinion. They have great football opinions, but you struggle with that at times. You struggle with the, I think I made my point here. I think I got this right. I think I'm going to help the team here. And then all of a sudden it's the next day we come back in the room and they've taken your idea and they've tabled it or gone a different direction. And that's the part about it I think is a little bit frustrating with working with the Cowboys. But then again, KG, I haven't been in a draft room with Jerry Jones since 2005. It's a long time. My experience of working with him then was always a great listener, but if you weren't the last guy to him, you might not get your opinion taken care of there.
Real quick, that 2005 draft, a hell of a draft for the Dallas Cowboys when people remember people like DeMarcus Ware and others who were parts of that 05. Hell of a draft class.
Ratliff. I mean, it was a lot of good. Yeah, that was a good draft. And again, that goes back to that's when your scouting department and your head coach really, really work well together. Bill Parcells, there was some disagreement along the way, no question. Some big time disagreement along the way. But there was also some big time, that's the right direction that we need to go from both sides. That's how a draft works in that regard.
I'm interested in this. What are you most proud of as far as your career is concerned? Obviously, the different places that you've been, the people that you've worked with, when you look back on it, what are you most proud of as far as your career is concerned?
That's a really good question because I was fortunate to be on a Super Bowl winning team in 1996. And the guys I worked with on that staff were the guys like John Dorsey, who's a longtime general manager, John Snyder, who's currently with Seattle, Ted Thompson, who we just lost a few years ago as a general manager to health issues, Sean Herrock, Scott McLuhan. Man, we had a great group of scouts. We really, really did. And I think the thing that was most proud is when we won the Super Bowl, and this is going to sound funny, but like back then in 1996, when we won the Super Bowl, we were named the All Madden Team Scouting Department. Like John Madden has his All Madden Scouting Department, and we were on it. And that in itself, the fact that how much pride as a group that we had, I was super proud of the fact that in Philadelphia, Jeff Lurie and Joe Banner gave myself and Mike Lombardi the job to have the draft, to run the draft in Philadelphia. We had 8 scouts, 4 of them quit before we started the draft meetings. And I had a coaching staff on the defensive side that wouldn't talk to me and Mike the whole year. So we went the whole entire year where they didn't talk to us because they felt we were there to get rid of the guy that they liked, Dick Daniels. They felt like the defensive guys really were close to the director of football operation. And they felt like that we were there to mess that all up. And Jeff Lurie, Joe Banner made the decision to move on from Dick Daniels. And I remember going into Emmett Thomas, a Hall of Fame player, and he was defensive coordinator. I remember going to his office and I said, listen, I go, Coach, if we don't communicate, I can't help you get players here. I can't. You've got to help me with this draft. You've got to tell me what you guys need for players. And, he looked at me, he had a big old dip in, he just kind of looked at me and he goes, all right, we'll do it. And I got so much help. Again, 4 of the 8 scouts quit because they didn't want to work with me. They the same reason. They just didn't want to be, with us anymore. And so myself and 3 other scouts put together a board. And that draft in Philly was one of those drafts where we were able to, 4 of the 8 picks we made the Pro Bowl within 3 years. And again, I talk about Andy Reid and how he was able to take the Trey Thomases and the Jeremiah Trotters and, Ike Reese and those guys. And he was able to take those players and, get the Philadelphia Eagles the way they were. So I'm super proud of the fact that we I'm super proud of the guys that stayed and fought through it with me. And I'm super proud of guys like a Mike Lombardi who made a trade for Hugh Douglas in the second round. Hugh Douglas was a guy with the Jets. And Michael said, hey, listen, I got a chance to get Hugh Douglas. I said, I've loved the player a long time. He goes, we could give up a second round pick. I said, Michael, we got nobody on that board that's better than Hugh Douglas in the second round. So we shipped it off to the Jets, actually traded to Parcells, which was funny. And, those are the kinds of things that, in this day and age, we're asked to overcome a lot, pandemics or loss of jobs or families changing and stuff. But at that time, man, I was super, I was excited. I was nervous, but it all just kind of came together because you know why? I was trained to do that. I was trained to be able to handle that situation. And a lot of people trusted me along the way. That's the best thing about it is when you have people. To this day, I could go up to Jeff Lurie and he thanks me for what we were able to do. I didn't get to see our draft through. I got to run the team starting in January, and by May that same year we were gone. A new regime had come in and had taken over, and so never got to see all my. I always competed against those guys, but I knew deep down inside that I knew that I did right by the Philadelphia Eagles. That was that was really, really proud time.
Where did you develop your work ethic from? Because for people who don't know, you obviously growing up in the DFW area, family working in, small business, developing small business, and had done some really amazing things in DFW in the area itself.
Right.
Where did that come from for you, as far as maybe from your parents or from someone else that you looked at and that kind of developed in you as far as that work ethic and that drive was concerned?
Yeah, I think a lot of it had to do with my family was in the restaurant business in Dallas, and anybody that's ever been in the restaurant business knows it's a 24/7 job. And, my family, to make sure that we had success. Again, I'm from an upper middle class family. I mean, I was very, very fortunate that the restaurant business was really, really good for us. But the restaurant business was good because we had a lot of repeat customers. We had a lot of people that they trusted us that, hey, your barbecue is going to be the best in Dallas. And, that was, I saw my dad work really, really hard at that. And my dad didn't get to spend a lot of time with him because he was gone. I was a kid. He was putting wood on the fire at 4:30 in the morning, or he was coming home at 9, 10 o'clock at night and I was already asleep. So, yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it had to do with the pride of seeing him work. And I know a lot of us are like, oh, we're influenced by our parents and work. But I've been with people, all through my career too, that work extremely hard, that don't, the hours. I mean, hell, I work with you. I've done a show, you've done a show, at 5:30 in the morning till 10 and come back and done a show with me from 2 to 7. There's people like you that in my life that I've seen like, hell, if they can do that, why can't I do that? Why? I don't need to complain or be upset by what's going on. I really, I draw from other people and I draw from work ethic and I see what people doing it the right way and not just trying to make shortcuts, but really do it the right way.
Last little bit before we let you go, and that work ethic in your career has led you into a lot of interest even outside of the National Football League. For people who don't know, Bryan is involved in race cars and has his own team. Tell us a little bit about how you got that interest and that itch as far as, racing was concerned.
Yeah, I've always been involved with racing since the early 90s. I could go all the way back to the 70s when my dad would watch, like in 1979, when the Daytona 500, when they're all wrecking in the infield and they're getting out and fighting everybody. I could go back that far watching racing. It's funny, racing has always been a passion of mine. I love it. There's a lot of similarities between football and auto racing. It's teamwork, it's luck, it's preparation. There's so much involved in how to win a race. And my interest really is in endurance racing. And if you've ever watched the movie Ford versus Ferrari, I'm involved with a team that does endurance racing, and it's based out of Reno, Nevada. And we've done a great job of, the team has done a great job of, like I say, we go to these tracks and, I've been to what's known as part of the Rolex 24. and you could Google it. It's an endurance race, 24 hours. Like I say, Ford versus Ferrari, the same movie, and it's the 24 hours of Daytona. And I've also been involved with my team with the 12 hours of Sebring, which is the next race. And then we just got word that we're going to get to race in Le Mans in France in the 24 hours of Le Mans in there. So this summer in June. So yeah, it's very, very exciting. We were a first-year team. We finished second in the points out of 10 teams. So we won a race at Watkins Glen, which is a famous racetrack.
Road course.
Famous road course in upstate New York. It was only a 6-hour race, but we brought it home that day. So yeah, it's very expensive. Luckily, I don't have to lay out a lot of cash. I don't have to myself. But racing is very expensive, especially on this end of racing. And so, it's funny. The team came together, and this is my story. I'll end it on here. The team came together. My partner and I were meeting. He's a member of the Cowboys club at the Star, and we came up with the idea on a napkin. We were sitting in the Cowboy club having dinner, and we started talking about racing and forming a racing team. And we wrote down the ideas and stuff on a napkin. You hear stories about that all the time.
Yeah.
And it just happened, Stephen Thomas, who I work with, he's the financier of it all. And he's the racer. He's actually one of the best gentleman drivers in the world. And he gets to drive the car and stuff. So it's a lot of fun for him. But yeah, the whole idea of us getting our racing together, our own racing team, happened at the Cowboys club up there in Frisco. So a lot of tie-ins, but it's super exciting. Like I say, the Rolex 24, we were winning the race. Our car first time out, we're winning. Like for 4 hours, we're winning this race.
Yeah.
And then about 2 a.m, the brake rotor, the front left brake rotor exploded in the wheel well, and we had to fix it, and it knocked us out of the race. That's the time when you're so happy. You're like, we're racing, we're doing well. And then you look up at the clock and you still got like 6 hours more of racing to do. Yeah. And you're just like, God, can we just hang on for 6 minutes?
Right.
But you have things happen to you that it's like football. It's the same thing. You're driving the ball, and you get down the red zone and you have a turnover, and it just kills you right there. So yeah, racing has always been a part of my life. I've always been guys and gals who work in racing always ask me, hey, who's my team going to take in the draft? And I'll tell them as long as they tell me how to make that car go 200 miles an hour. So there's a lot of really good trade-offs with my knowledge, with their knowledge. We have a lot of fun with that.
Well, last question for you. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about this year's NFL draft specific to the Dallas Cowboys, who hold the number 24 overall pick, people who are interested in that sort of thing. Where do you think at this point, with less than a week to go before the draft, the Cowboys go potentially with that number 24 overall pick? I don't have a race car to make go faster, so I had to ask you the question. You got
a captive audience today.
Yeah.
I would say this, though. They need help along the offensive line. Now, will they take a guard? It's the whole offensive line. Your right tackle, who you moved on from, he couldn't bend. You couldn't play him at guard. That's what they'll tell you. You got a guy that's playing right tackle now that has some issues, but he's not terrible. The right guard's a Hall of Fame player. The center got better as the season went on. The left guard was a mess. And then the left tackle didn't absolutely play his best in the playoff, and we might be starting to see some slippage over there. So, when you start to talk about tackles, guard, center, I think they're all fair game over there. I think anything to do with the offensive line, this team halfway through the season was unstoppable on offense. The problem is now, halfway finished, whether it was the OC, the head coach, the quarterback, the line, the running backs, they could not run the football. They could not help the quarterback. And there's people that will argue with you to have these discussions and say, well, all right, Dak Prescott, here we are with Dak Prescott. Is he to the level where he's going to be? Is he going to have help? Is this, or can he get better? Those are the arguments, but I think it's going to have to start with that offensive line. I think they're open. I think they're open to taking a receiver. I think they're open to taking a defensive player if it's the right one. But I think you're probably going to see one of those guards get selected, whether it's Zion Johnson, Boston College, super smart guy, can play center also, or with Kenyon Green from Texas A&M, who can also play guard, can also play tackle, a little bit more of a powerful guy, more than, say, Zion Johnson, who's a little bit better athlete. So it's just going to be which direction that they maybe want. But I think that guard will be the spot which they're going to go with right now.
I think that's a perfect way to end it, because this year's NFL draft, of course, is in Las Vegas, where the Raiders are now. And, of course, your foray with Al Davis for a couple of weeks.
Guess you can pick up your stuff and go. I mean, I remember walking out of his office, and I went into Mike Lombardi's office, and I said, "Hey, I'm done." He goes, "What do you mean you're done?" I said, "The old man just told me to go home. So I'm going home. So I'm going to go pack my boxes, make sure they please mail them all to me." And he did, mailed them all to me. So that was it. That was my 2 weeks with the Oakland Raiders at the time.
Well, it sounds like you owe Mark Davis a visit in Vegas to talk to him about what
his dad was fascinating, though. His dad was fascinating to work for. He really was.
He is an Emmy winner, a proud LSU Tiger, and if you catch him on the right day, can get you a good crawfish boil going too.
There you go.
And you can find him on Twitter at Bryan Broaddus. He is host of one of the three hosts of the G-Bag Nation, along with Gavin Dawson, Lucius Alexander, every Monday through Friday, 2 to 7 p.m. on 105 through the Fan. Of course, his name is Bryan Broaddus. Bryan, thank you so much for the time, for joining me here on the Gray Area Podcast. Really appreciate it, and hope to do this again sometime.
Thanks, KG. Anytime, buddy.
This has been the Gray Area Podcast. Remember, you can subscribe to the Gray Area on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts for free. And, of course, here on YouTube at Kevin Gray Sports. And be sure to write a review, give a 5-star rating for the podcast. And we'll be back on Monday. We'll talk to you later. Peace.